Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back. This is Dr. Cassandra Quabe, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. Today on the show, we're going to be discussing nutrition from the earliest age, and that begins with mother's milk. Our guest today is Dr. Lars Bode. He is a professor of pediatrics and the Larsen Rosenquist Foundation Chair of Collaborative Human Milk Research. He's also the founding director of the Mother Milk Infant Center of Research Excellence and founding director of the Human Milk Institute at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Bode leads a research program dedicated to breastfeeding and human milk in general and human milk oligosaccharides in particular. His main research objectives are to understand how milk components are synthesized in the mother's mammary gland, how milk composition is affected by external factors such as nutrition, pathogens, or medications, and how milk components affect immediate as well as long term health and development of infants and mothers, and how they can serve as natural templates for the development of preventatives, therapeutics, and diagnostics for people of all ages. Dr. Bode is certainly an expert in this space. I was so excited to get him on the show. He's given over 250 lectures at national and international events. He's published nearly 200 peer reviewed articles on the topic of human milk and is ranked in the top 0.1% of most highly cited scientists in the world in 2022. In addition, he also serves as a member of the WHO's World Health Emergencies Program to advise on the safety of breastfeeding and human milk during emergencies. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Lars. It's really nice to meet you.
Thank you so much for having me, Cassandra.
Maybe we can start with some of the basics and tell us a bit more about this institute, the Human Milk Institute. From what I understand, this is the first and only institute that's solely dedicated to human milk and breastfeeding. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Stunningly so. You would assume that there's many more institutes dedicated to human milk and breastfeeding since it's so, common. Every single life on Earth somehow gets exposed to that in the first few months of life. You either get breast milk or you get infant formula, and that infant formula is, of course, heavily modeled after breast milk. So, there's no way around it. One way or another, you get exposed to it. And yes, it's true. So the Human Milk Institute started in 2022 and is really an umbrella structure of some of the entities we already had at the university. So there's research center, there is a biorepository, there's a milk bank, clinical programs, educational programs, rapid response programs, technology development. So we had a bunch of those different entities already on campus. UCSD has a very long, strong track record in this field. And we thought it was time to bring this all under one roof and start a Human Milk Institute. And here we are, for 2 years in, or 3 years in, and going strong.
That's incredible. I think it's so exciting to have like a concentrated space for research on this topic because surprisingly, even though human milk is really at the foundation of humanness of what we start with as infants, I feel like the science is still evolving, right? What can you tell us about the science behind milk? Maybe beginning with composition. Like, what is human milk made of?
So when we think of human milk, I think what we think of first is nutrition, right? It's nutrition for the baby. And, fittingly so, we have a foodie podcast here. So, of course, it's the first food for the baby. So you have your proteins and your fats, your carbohydrates, the calories that go in, and then the micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, just like you have, when you talk about food in general. And that's the very basic. So you want baby to grow, to thrive, build muscles, build all those functional organs. And so that's the very basics when you think about human milk. But there's so much more to it. And that's where your pharmacology part comes in, where we have a lot of components in human milk, a bioactive component that really protects the baby from different diseases, from pathogens, from bacteria, from viruses, so they don't get their ear infection that often, they don't get their diarrheal diseases that often, respiratory infections that often. So there's real medicine in human milk if you want. And then the third part is that milk is also there to communicate between mom and baby. So hormones, for example, that kind of screen the hormonal state of mom are transferred over to the baby, give different cues of satiety and stress and all those kinds of things. So it's nutrition, protection, and communication, I would say.
Incredible. So when we think about infant nutrition, even beginning the womb, am I correct in understanding that there are the foods that a mother consumes during pregnancy that some of the molecules in those foods, for example, phytochemicals, the nutrients, different types of health benefiting molecules from those foods also transfer to the baby. Does the same hold true for milk? Are you also sharing some of those ingredients that you're consuming? Do those get transferred to the infant as well?
Yeah, to a certain extent, that's also true. And maybe going back to the step of the in utero during embryonic development, I think a lot of people think, oh, now I can finally eat as much and as I want, and wear the milkshakes and wear the burgers and the pizzas, right? But truth is, you're already setting the stage, the metabolic stage for your offspring later on in life. So, you have to be somewhat mindful that you eat still high quality food because it does affect the growing fetus already in utero. And the same is true in milk. There are studies that show that women that eat a healthier diet, women that exercise frequently, if possible, of course, right after birth, that's very difficult. But in general, have a healthy lifestyle that affects the composition of human milk. And that affects the health status of the baby short term and eventually long term as well.
It's great. Well, let's talk about some of the health benefits of breast milk for the infant. Um, do the benefits or I have so many questions. I'm trying to think how to phrase these. So, when you first start breastfeeding, there are certain elements in the milk that aren't present in such high levels later when the baby's months old. Correct? I'm thinking about colostrum in particular. So,
Mhm.
how does the milk composition change over time, and how is this in line with the baby's different stages of development?
Yeah. So milk composition does change. Colostrum is very different, highly concentrated in protein and fat and energy. Many of the immune components are at much higher concentrations in colostrum, but you also get just a tiny little volume of that, right? At the beginning, it's just a few milliliters that you get in the first few days. And then it changes through the transition into mature milk. That's around 10 days, 2 weeks, when full milk is very different in composition. And it continues to change over the course of lactation, depending on how long you're breastfeeding. But not only that, it's not just this long time horizon, it's during the day as well. You see changes in the morning. Milk composition is different than it is at night. So again, that brings it to those cues of, when does the baby sleep? When is the baby supposed to wake up and be awake? But even within a feed, we see that there's fat content is different at the beginning of a feed than it is at the end of it. So there's this whole interaction between mom, milk, and baby is highly dynamic when it comes to time.
Incredible. So, when we think about in my head, I've been thinking about normal term infants that have, been delivered at the appropriate number of weeks of gestation. How about infants that are born premature? Um, how important is breast milk for this population of children?
Yeah. It can literally be life-saving for these preterm or premature babies that are born way before the 40 weeks or 37 weeks, which we consider term. And there we have to see. I mean, it's possible now to have babies at 24 weeks or 23 weeks, and they survive. I mean, they're tiny. They're 500, 600 grams, which is like your soda can. If you grab a soda can, it's usually 330 ml plus the can. That's 500 grams. So that's how much the tiniest littlest babies weigh, and they can survive. And that comes, of course, with a lot of complications. How do you feed a baby that's supposed to be still in utero in the womb? That's not supposed to get human milk, right? I mean, that's just not the way evolution had created this originally. And there is milk supply, there is colostrum, there's milk, human milk. And is it sufficient for the preterm baby? So sometimes you need to fortify that to bring up the calorie content, to provide more protein, to provide some other nutrients. But again, we see this dramatically. There is a condition called necrotizing enterocolitis. It's a mouthful. I call it short neck, so necrotizing enterocolitis neck. And we know that about 5 to 10% of the preterm babies develop this devastating disease in the gut, and many of them die from this disease. And strikingly, there's a 6 to 10-fold lower risk if these babies are fed human milk. So we're literally talking about life-saving properties of human milk for the preterm baby.
That's great. Well, I recall also we had a prior episode where we spoke with an expert on milk components that don't necessarily are digested by the human body, but are digested instead by certain microbiota. Do you think that this plays a big role in the importance of human milk for babies? It's not just for the body, but also for the microbes that we're starting to cultivate in their bodies.
Yeah, that's the hot topic, right? The whole microbiome is everywhere, and everyone's studying the microbiome and tries to associate the gut microbiome or the skin microbiome or any microbiome in any niche of the body with some health outcome, and then try to tweak that either with probiotics or prebiotic molecules to feed certain bacteria that are desired and hopefully shape the health outcome. And that's true for human milk as well. That's one of the benefits of human milk. Human milk has many components that help shape microbial communities in the infant gut. The infant gut is almost sterile when you're born. There are some bacteria that come through either the birth canal or if you have a C-section, less so. And then it picks up the environment and picks from your food what kind of bacteria can move into your body and eventually reside in the gut and then build that microbial community. And human milk provides those components, the prebiotics. So these are components that are not metabolized or utilized by the baby itself, but that go all the way down into the later part of your intestine. And then that's where the bacteria are, and they can selectively metabolize those. So there's a host of bacteria that can metabolize those specific prebiotics and then thrive and potentially have a health benefit on the baby. And this may last for, your entire life. What you see in the beginning in the first few months of life is really what sets you up for good health later on.
Incredible. Well, we've spoken about some of the health benefits of milk. I'm wondering, I want to go back to this earlier comment you made about um, exposures that the mother has and how this might also translate to health. So we've talked about diet. Um, Recently in the news, in the scientific literature, and also in the popular press, there have been a number of articles around the detrimental effects of ultra processed foods on our diets. And I think this is something that we all kind of, yeah, it's not good to eat these very high ultra processed foods. Do we know what the impact of kind of junk food is on mother's milk for infants? I mean, it's not just about the mother's health is very important, but does this also have a negative consequence for the baby?
Yeah, I think we have some data on that. One example is women that are on a high sucrose or in a high fructose diet. So a lot of those ultra processed food with added sugars and high fructose in it. Uh, Studies have shown that that fructose makes it into milk as well, and baby gets exposed to that. We don't know exactly what the ramifications are, what the outcome is for the baby. But there's a clear link that milk composition at least changes if mom is on a not so healthy diet with lots of ultra processed foods.
And what about other exposures? So I'm thinking in particular of things like cigarettes or alcohol or other things that are not good for our health as adults. Do those also get transferred to the infant through the milk? Or even in addition to things that we intentionally are exposed to, like cigarettes or tobacco or alcohol or drugs? What about viruses and what about microplastics? Like, how does all of that translate here?
Yeah, that's all great questions. Let's start with the medications maybe, because that's a huge topic of interest currently, and we have an entire center of research therapeutics dedicated to this, an NIH-funded program. There's multiple different centers in the US, so we are one of them. So they're building this network to understand what medications in the maternal infant space really do, and how this all works. Maybe to set the stage there is that very often breastfeeding and or pregnant and breastfeeding women are excluded from a lot of those drug studies, clinical studies, to protect them. Right? We don't want to, do any experiments and clinical studies on women that are either pregnant or lactating because we don't want to harm the fetus or the breastfed child. At the same time, that creates a huge gap in knowledge because in the end, we know that 70, 80% of pregnant and lactating women still use some form of medication. And we can't give them any advice really on whether that medication is either making it into milk or if milk changes efficacy and safety of medications that we give to the baby. There's very limited data around this because we excluded women in these specific stages of their lives to protect them, but it also means there's a gap in knowledge. So that's what we're trying to tease out right now to see multiple different layers. What if mom gets a certain medication? She needs to have that medication, right? Sometimes you have no choice. Your life may depend on it. You have, let's say you have arthritis and you need to take a certain arthritis medication, or you're pregnant and breastfeeding. So what happens to that medication? Does it make it into the milk? Is it in high sufficient concentrations to affect the baby negatively or positively, potentially? And then on the other hand as well, what if baby gets medications? So let's say baby gets some antibiotics or something, very commonly done, right? So babies that now receive human milk with all the other bioactive factors, does it change the metabolism of those drugs? Does it change the efficacy of those drugs, the safety of those drugs? Maybe we can use less of those drugs because mom already provides some of those benefits with milk. That's all something that we're trying to study now, and that's fairly new and urgently needed because we've been neglecting this for so long.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that is an interesting paradox. I mean, for a long time, a lot of our drug studies were based on men, and women in general were excluded. Now we include women, but you're right. This is a massive population that's not being included in a lot of these studies. We need to know more about safety. So, okay, so we talked about pharmaceuticals. What about other environmental exposures? What are the risks there for breastfeeding infants?
So let's check on viruses and bacteria or pathogens in general. Very hot topic, of course. It was 5 years ago when SARS-CoV-2 came along, and I remember this very well. It was mid-March when the pandemic was called to 2020, and people were like, "Okay, what do we do? Do we have if mom is exposed, mom is infected? Is mom continuing to breastfeed? Is mom stopping to breastfeed now? What happens with all the donor milk that we give to babies in our neonatal intensive care units? Is the virus making it into that stream as well, and potentially then putting already very vulnerable babies at risk?" So we started out studying that here at UC San Diego, and it took us about 2 months to get an answer that SARS-CoV-2 is not transmitted. There's no active virus in human milk. We were able to inform the WHO, and they changed their recommendations accordingly. Um, and we're trying to scale that currently, where we say, well, the next pandemic is likely going to come. H5N1 is probably just around the corner for humans. Um, do we have an infrastructure in place where we can quickly make these assessments? We've done this for Mpox, for example, recently. What kind of infrastructure do we need to have in place to answer those questions quickly? Because 2 months was fast, but 2 months is a long time if moms are not uh, uh, do not have the information to say whether to continue to breastfeed or not, right? I mean, you can't just stop for 2 months and then, oh, now we have the answer, let's continue. Baby is not going to like that. So that's something that we're actively doing at the institute. We have an entire program called the Rapid Response Program together here with our virologists and epidemiologists to set up an infrastructure that needs funding as well to have those pathways in place and protocols in place that we can answer those questions quickly when the next pandemic. So yeah, viruses, pathogens. The beauty there is though that mom is responding this very nicely. So mom responds, has an infection to SARS-CoV-2, let's say, or to other infections, or whether it's the flu or whatever it is, and then starts making antibodies herself. And those protective molecules then make it into human milk and protect the baby. So it's not just a risk for the baby to get infected by these pathogens, viruses or bacteria, but mom actually makes protective molecules to make sure that baby is safe. It surveys the environment and sees, okay, what kind of pathogens are around right now. I mount an immune response, and then those immune protection factors get transferred through the milk.
Amazing. Well, I'm wondering, when it comes to HIV positive mothers, is HIV passed down through milk, or can you be on antiretrovirals to help prevent that transmission? Because I know that you can pass it through during birth. What about for milk?
Yeah, that there's a huge change currently in guidelines and the way we think about this. And you're absolutely right with antiretroviral treatment. If mom is very well controlled, the benefits of providing human milk might outweigh the risk of getting infected. And this is certainly true for low middle income countries where you have very resource limited settings. The risk of getting other infections, diarrheal infections, let's say, and dying from that because you're not exposed to human milk if you stop breastfeeding because you're HIV positive is certainly a much, much higher risk of dying from other diseases than contracting HIV. And yet again, there is something in human milk. We've studied this a few years ago that actually stops the transmission of HIV through breastfeeding. So so even though you have an HIV infected mom, and even though that mom is not on antiretroviral treatment, about 85% of the infants do not get infected, although they constantly get exposed to the virus through the milk. And then we found that there's actually something in human milk, and it brings it back to those oligosaccharide that we study, that apparently blocks the viral entry into the baby's body. So, yeah, milk can be a vehicle for transfer of these potentially deadly diseases, but milk often has a mechanism to say, wait a second, we need to protect the baby. We have these molecules in place to stop transmission. I think that's very powerful to learn from human milk.
Amazing. Um, and then I'll just circle back to this last one's about microplastics, alcohol, tobacco. Do we know anything about that? Like, does that reach the milk?
Yeah, very, very little. We just started a study on microplastics, and I know there's a couple of studies that look at cannabis exposure. There's a little bit of on cigarette smoking, alcohol. Certainly, if you're overdoing that, that's a huge problem for the baby as well. So please don't overdo that. In fact, there's certain studies that show that even the glass can be too much already. But it's also other things. Caffeine exposure. If you have too much caffeine, that's a signal that could go over to the baby, and the baby is way more active and can't sleep or whatever. It's just like us,
I want my baby go to
Uh,
sleep. Maybe those
there-
those all those Starbucks trips are not good for the baby.
uh,
Yeah.
well, there's a trade-off, right? Because you also don't get a long sleep as mom. So
Yeah.
mom maybe needs a little bit help to stay awake. And certainly there's a trade-off there as well.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about mom. We've been discussing milk from the lens of the infant, but what are there benefits for breastfeeding mothers, and what do we know about those benefits so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the fascinating part that you're absolutely right. We always talk about the baby, right? So mom needs to breastfeed to give, all the goodies to the baby, and it doesn't matter what's happening to her, she's just there to support and nourish and nurture. But truth is that there's good data that shows that women who breastfeed, and sometimes the longer they breastfeed, they have a lower risk for cardiovascular disease. So that's your heart attack, stroke. We lose millions of people to these diseases every year. Um, the same is true with diabetes, and very strong data showing that women who breastfeed are at a lower risk for breast cancer and ovarian cancer. So the benefits are not just on the infant side. There's certainly benefits on the maternal side. And what people always say, whether that's is a real health benefit or not, but I hear very often that women say, "Oh, I got in shape much faster because I was breastfeeding, and all those calories that go into making milk helped me lose weight and the pregnancy weight faster." Is certainly appealing as well, although that's probably not the most important part of this part.
No, I mean, I'll say just in full disclosure, I'm very pro breastfeeding. I breastfed all three of my children, um, and I definitely lost weight a lot faster after each pregnancy. And it offers, I think, too, maybe even more importantly, psychologically, is this the health benefits of having a closer bond with your infant. There's something really special about the act of breastfeeding.
Mm.
And it can be challenging too. I didn't know what I was doing. I just assumed the baby would automatically know what they're doing. And for any of the expectant mothers listening, it's okay. There are people that will show you how it works at the hospital because
Yeah,
I just didn't do it right. And so I
yeah.
had some issues when I started off that were easily corrected. So but I think
I
there are
would
numerous benefits. Yeah.
I would add to that, Cassandra, if I may interrupt.
Mhm.
It's there's two things to it. One is like take it easy. Giving birth to a baby is not that straightforward, and the baby is like you said, it's not just crawling up and latching on and if it doesn't happen, you do something wrong. That's just not the way it is. Yeah. We were
Yeah.
told that for our first baby as well. And that's certainly not how it went. Especially, under severe circumstances, you have a C-section, you're still,
Mhm.
somewhat drugged up and
Yeah.
there's many other things going on. That's not how easy it is. So I would say take it easy, but educate yourself ideally before. Don't, in this whole stressful situation postpartum where your mental health is also in jeopardy and your hormones are going haywire. That's not the time to start thinking about breastfeeding. Think about this before. I would even advocate for education around breastfeeding as early as in schools. We need to normalize
Yeah.
breastfeeding and make sure that this is not just some icky thing. And then once the baby is out, okay, now what do I do? I think we just need to do much, much better as a society to normalize breastfeeding, support it, and then promote and help women to, with their breastfeeding goals. And again, I
Yeah.
can't emphasize this enough. Also, please don't stigmatize someone who is not breastfeeding, who can't breastfeed, or is not working as
Yeah.
well, or decide to not to do it because for whatever reason. That's certainly not what we want to say here either. It's your choice, it's your body, it's whatever you decide
Yeah.
is best for you and the baby and your circumstance.
Well, I had my first child when I was in graduate school, and one of my professors gave me a book called The Womanly Art of Breastfeeding for my baby shower. And that I loved that book. It really helped me to glean some information about it. And it can be challenging just from my own personal experience of, not everyone is accustomed to seeing women breastfeeding, or if you're out and about and the baby's hungry, you have to kind of get this whole tense thing going because you don't
Mhm.
want to offend anyone, and it's the baby doesn't like it. You're panicking because they're crying and hungry. So there is a lot of stigma, I think, on both sides of, and we have to do better. And I think that I've traveled the world many times around, and I can say there are other cultures that do get it a lot better, that where it's a much more accepted part of the rhythm of life. And but I also agree, it's great that we have opportunities and options for other for formula in cases where it's not possible to breastfeed for whatever reason. And return to the workplace is also a big barrier for many women. There's not always space for lactation, for pumping. Um, I have some horrific. They're funny now, but they were horrific at the time. Stories of traveling with my breast pump and frying the breast pump on foreign electrical outlets and
Oh, wow.
panic trying to find an emergency solution. So it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do while traveling if you're away from the baby. But I think this is a really good point about give yourself some grace, get educated, make an informed choice before it gets to go day of making that final
Indeed.
decision.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Well,
And yes, it's true that, breastfeeding is superior over infant formula on average, if you look at the
mhm,
population basis and health outcomes. And yet that's where I see also our, moral obligation to make infant formula better as well. Will it be ever be as good as human milk? No. But, every baby should have the best start to life. And we can't, uh, we can't demonize formula companies. They certainly have their issues with unfair marketing practices, but in the end, what matters is the health outcome for mom and baby, and that's where we all need to do better.
absolutely. Well, this segues great into my next question because I really want to get nerdy with you. And
Mhm.
let's talk
Do
mass
it.
spec. Let's talk
Oh,
metabolomics. Let's
okay.
let's get into the nuts and bolts of um how do you in your institute, how do you study the composition of human milk, and how can this inform choices in how to formulate even better artificial formulas? How do we make options available to all infants regardless of whether they're able to access human breast milk?
Yeah, again, it's hard to believe it's 2025, and I was part of a National Academies working group a few years ago that looked at the evidence for milk composition and how strong is the evidence for certain things. And it focused specifically on micronutrients, so that's vitamins and minerals. And you would think we know everything about that, right? Human milk, your first few food, how long have we been exposed to that? And the truth is, the outcome of that working group was evidence is actually not that strong. We don't know much about these things in human milk yet. There is thousands of studies that we screened through, and many of the technologies that were used were insufficient. Sampling techniques were insufficient to make um, real predictions. So that's something we're changing at the institute. We have a dedicated milk analytics core called MAC, and there we are establishing and rigorously validating assays to measure. First, starting out with micronutrients. So we're just going through the minerals and trace minerals and ultra trace minerals, vitamins, water soluble, and fat soluble, to really have validated tools that work with human milk. Human milk is not cow milk. Human milk is not blood, is not urine. It's very different. The matrix is different. Components are different. Interferences are very different when it comes to the technologies. So that's one thing. Then macronutrients is a given. Some of the bioactives, oligosaccharides being one, proteins, peptides, proteases, lipids, fatty acids, you name it, we're trying to add that on to the milk analytics core, but at the same time, we have a lot of investigators that do either targeted metabolomics. You mentioned the word, so I just use it too. Now let's get nerdy. Or
Please, yes.
untargeted metabolomics. And we see, if you look at these things, there's like 5,000 different compounds in there, and we know maybe 20% of them what they are. The other 80%, we don't really know what it is. We see that as peaks in the mass spec, but we don't really know what it is. So there's a lot of discovery potential there still. And then how do we make sure that we understand what these molecules do, right? So at the same time, I'm always talking about this mother milk infant triad. We coined this term in a science perspective back in 2020, week before the pandemic, out of all times, where we coined this phrase, the mother milk infant triad, that we need to better understand. So we need to characterize mom's characteristics, genetics, epigenetics, nutrition, exercise, what kind of drugs, what kind of whatever she's exposed to. Then we need to characterize milk composition in that scenario, and then all the growth characteristics, genetics, everything on the baby side as well. Put that into context, take all the exposome, as we say, into context as well, and then use a systems biology approach to really understand how all those data points are linked together to drive optimal maternal infant health outcomes, and how milk plays a role as the mediator in all this, right? So that's a huge undertaking. We're just starting now, but those advances in technologies, metabolomics and lipidomics and proteomics and all the different omics that we have working on human milk oligosaccharides, or HMOs, we now call that HMomics. So I had to
I like
add that one to it as well. I think that's a huge undertaking still, but that's what's needed to understand what the totality of this triad is actually contributing to health, how alterations in maternal health might ripple through that entire triad and then affect milk composition and infant outcomes as well, and how we can potentially learn from that, make better infant formula. But the truth is, it's highly dependent on that maternal infant triad, right? Every mom is different, every baby is different, and that's maybe why every milk is different. Human milk is not always the same; it changes over time, and it's very different between different individuals. So to put this into an infant formula, into one standardized product, is going to be extremely difficult to do.
Yeah.
And that will have to change over time. It has to be different for different baby, at least for different categories. So that's where personalized nutrition and personalized medicine really comes into play. Very difficult to do that, of course, on a product level.
Yeah. Well, and I do want to, for the newer listeners to foodie pharmacology, we've covered in other episodes the details of how mass spectrometry works. And I just want to put a shout out for these two episodes. There's one with Nadja Chek. There's also one with Laura Sanchez, where we kind of get down into like how these things work. Think of it as every molecule is a puzzle that you throw against a jigsaw puzzle. You're throwing against the wall and you're trying to put the pieces back together. And in some cases, we know what that puzzle is supposed to look like. And in most cases, we don't. And so we know there are lots of things that it sounds like in the case of human milk, thousands of different unique things, whether they're proteins or sugars or micronutrients. So thousands of things. And remember, science works best, at least the classic science has worked best. So we change one variable, we look at one thing and we see what that one thing, how that changes in an experiment. And when you have this incredible complexity, I mean, I think it's both exciting scientifically, but also incredibly challenging. Where do you see you mentioned some of these newer tools, and I've started to hear a bit more about AI enabled targeted metabolomics or untargeted like AI and assisting untargeted metabolomics. Like, do you foresee um, any of these new and emerging technologies being applied to our understanding of human milk?
Yeah, and they are. You're absolutely right. The times of the reductionist scientist approach, where you look at one particular molecule and you try to uh, see what that molecule is doing in isolation and without taking the context into consideration. I think those days are over. It's much easier to do that. It was not trivial to start with, but truth is that's not how nature works. And science is trying to understand how nature works, and nature does not work one component at a time. So yeah, it takes a lot of analytical finesse to collect all that data in a validated way. Again, I think I can only repeat this. The data that you put into these systems, if you're talking about systems biology and large data sets and AI and all these different tools that are now available, they're only as good as the data that you put in. So you need to have validated assays that can reproducibly pick up what you actually want to measure. And that could be milk composition, that could be maternal factors, infant factors, everything to describe this triad in a systems biology way. So what data goes in is very important. And then you're absolutely right. How do you make sense of this onslaught of massive amount of data? And that's where indeed AI and other machine learning tools and things are going to play or are already playing a massive role. And uh, we are building this milk analytics core, and in parallel, we're building a data hub with our folks here at that work on artificial intelligence to already build an infrastructure underneath to say when all this data comes in, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to make sense of that? And I think that highlights again the need to work together with people that come from different disciplines. In this case, engineers or the AI folks that have those algorithms or can build those algorithms. My favorite sentence in all of this is innovation lives at the intersection of disciplines, bringing people together that are not all the same, but that work on different aspects that bring different expertise. That's going to help us solve these massive puzzles that we're facing.
Incredible. Um, so before we end, I do want to turn to another topic we've covered previously on this show in brief. This idea of um, milks. I'm speaking about milk for adults, so non-dairy, non-cow milk, but instead pea protein based milk, or soy milk, or almond, or oat. I feel like there's every little vegetable they're milking, milking these days. But there are also challenges with some of these alternate milks. There are issues with sustainability. I could argue in some cases these are actually ultra processed food products. Um, so not as natural and healthy as they may be advertised to be. And I'm wondering, is there a world where this knowledge and understanding of human milk might be translated into a product that could be healthy also for adults? Or is that something that's not being explored, or is this a crazy idea I'm proposing here?
Not a crazy
Yeah.
idea at all. I
Okay.
love crazy ideas, and this is certainly it is a crazy idea, but maybe not that far fetched. So we are working on that, and there's other people that work on something very similar. Not so much about. So the idea is certainly not please drink human milk because it has health benefits for adults. Human milk is made for human babies. There is a limited amount of human milk. Please don't take this away from the babies. Donate it if you have an excess of human milk. Donate it to a milk bank, like a certified milk bank, so they can process it and give it to babies in need, which mostly are the babies in the neonatal intensive care units that really need human milk. They their survival depends on it. However, as we're understanding how these different molecules in human milk work on a deep mechanistic level in the context of maternal infant health, we can see can we leverage that knowledge and can we leverage some of these molecules in human milk to develop therapeutics, supplements, biosolutions for people of all ages. And I give you one example. We recently published a study where we took immune cells in tissue culture and exposed it to these human milk oligosaccharides that we're working on. And we found that you can activate these immune cells so they get all hyperactivated and they do their thing, they need to fight certain diseases or whatever it is. But that's not always a good thing. There is certainly chronic inflammatory diseases where a hyperimmune system can be detrimental to your health. And examples are arthritis, atherosclerosis, obesity, uh, even diabetes. All these major diseases that we're facing are often linked to a chronic inflammatory state. So we found that yes, you can activate those cells in culture, but if you add human milk oligosaccharides to it, they shut down much faster. So you're not going in this chronic inflammatory state. And that makes sense for the infant in certain instances. But if you look at something like atherosclerosis, that's where you have those immune cells. They swim around in your blood. They're hyperactive. They take up all your fat that's swimming in the blood, clog up your arteries, and you end up with a heart attack. So we took this knowledge and said, like, what if we feed this particular oligosaccharide to an animal model that we triggered to get atherosclerosis and eventually, that leads to heart attack or stroke? And we found this works beautifully. If these animals feed on this one human milk compound, you could put this in the drinking water, their risk of clogging their arteries, you could see this like literally in the arteries that you visualize. Their arteries are nice and clean, and the ones that didn't get these human milk oligosaccharides, they clog up eventually, they get plugs, and they eventually are at risk of getting a heart attack. So if we scale this to adults, we lose about 18 million people a year to cardiovascular disease, heart attack, and stroke. If we can save a few million people of that by giving it a compound that we can either synthetically make, and that's possible right now, we can make these compounds on a ton scale. So we give this to adults. We know it's safe because we give it to babies every 2-3 hours, right?
That's
So
right.
we can easily give it to adults. It doesn't cost, it costs a fraction of the drugs that we currently have out there. And that's indeed the direction that we're going. Can we learn from human milk that's battle tested throughout evolution to be not only safe, but in many cases efficacious for all kinds of diseases, and apply that to diseases that we're now facing, in our current lifestyle as we get older, and use these individual components. Not saying to drink human milk, please don't, uh, but to make those individual components available and really learn on a deep level what human milk is providing for the infant, and then leveraging that knowledge and building new therapeutics. I think that's definitely needed.
You're so speaking my language right now because I mean, this is very much like the approach I take in looking at plant natural products, looking for new therapies from nature and thinking about how this could be deployed on a larger scale. I mean, that's so exciting. And I know UCSD has a great environment for technology transfer. Is this being spun out into a company or are you guys exploring this?
So this particular example is licensed out to different companies. So they are
Great.
exploring this further to bring this into clinical studies. The same application is also relevant not only for atherosclerosis or heart attack and stroke, but also for arthritis. I mentioned that before. Same mechanism, same immune cells, but now in your joints. There is potentially a market for pets as well. A lot of pets, because of the inbreeding, have very high risk of osteoarthritis. So these molecules might help there as well. So it's not just people of all ages, but it's pets as well.
I love that.
Um,
That's great.
yeah. So indeed, we are, we have those technologies and licenses available. And we just today announced a new initiative with our colleagues here at the Institute for Engineering and Medicine and the Jacob Center for Health Innovations, where we're working together to build new technologies around human milk. That's devices or point of care or things like what we just described about therapeutics. So there will be a lot more coming out. We're getting more and more people engaged in this field, which is amazing to see. You should see this. The people that work on atherosclerosis or arthritis with us, they've never worked on human milk before. And we give them some components here. Can you try this out? What do you think? And then they benchmark that against like the big TNF-alpha blockers or whatever it is. And then they come back and say, what did you give us there? What is this molecule? So it's isolate from human milk. They're like, really? Are you kidding me? It's impossible. This is working so well. So I think more and more people are latching on to the power of human milk, pun intended.
Mhm.
And we'll see a lot more innovations coming out of this in the next few years.
I mean, I love this story because it really shows the value of basic science. I mean, I think we have to speak about this too. Science is something that's in large part invested in by our federal government, and those investments are critical to continue to generate new innovations, new medicines, and you know, if someone had asked me, is the next drug for arthritis, where is that going to come from? I never would have said, "Oh, well, obviously it's going to come from this milk molecule." I mean,
Yeah.
so we find, I think, through rigorous basic science can really lead us down some incredible paths that can bring so many benefits to people um, across the globe. So that's really exciting. I've really enjoyed this discussion so much. I could probably speak with you for another 2 hours, but we are
Sure,
out of
sure.
time on the show.
Yeah.
Lars, thank you for being with us. This was really exciting, and I'm sure
Thank
the
you so
audience is
much.
going to really enjoy this listen. All
Thank you for
right.
having me. Much appreciated.
Yeah.
Great conversation.
And before we end, I want to also add, where can folks go to learn more about your institute? Is there a website that we can direct them to?
Yes, please. So website is hmi.ucsd.edu. That's the institute. You'll find all the information there, what we do. You'll find my contact information. Please uh, send me an email or call me up if you want. And we're also on social media. LinkedIn is our preferred platform. So you can find me there under my name. We do have an annual symposium. The next one is coming up in 3 weeks, March 4th to 6th. And if you're interested in the science around human milk, everything from molecular discoveries to local and global public health, that's what we're discussing there. It's an experience. It's right by the ocean. What can I say more? March in San Diego is the best place to be, probably. And it's open to the public. We have very low registration rates for the community because we really want to make this topic accessible to everyone.
That's great.
And yeah,
And is
please
that
join
an
us.
annual symposium, Lars? Is that
Yeah,
something? Okay, fantastic.
yeah.
So if
So
you
it's an
missed
annual
this one, you've
symposium.
got it. Yeah,
Come next year.
fantastic.
We are very fortunate that we got a endowment last year that we invest in, and that helps us to have this symposium subsidized in
Wonderful.
perpetuity every year to make it accessible for everyone.
Exciting. Great. Well, thank you so much, Lars. And thank you, foodies, for tuning in and listening to this. Again, we are in season 7. How exciting is that? We've got lots of great episodes coming for you this year. I want to thank our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, for putting on a great show. And thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in each and every week. You can find this episode at our website at foodiepharmacology.com. Of course, you can find us on all of your favorite podcast streaming platforms as well. And if you'd like to see the video version of this show, you can head over to the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel, where we have a special playlist of all of the foodie pharmacology episode. Thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and we'll see you next time.